Nice to see you, Todd. Why don't you give us a little bit of biographical information before we launch into Christianity and death? Who are you? Where are you?
Yeah. So I'm coming from this. I'm coming at this mostly as an artist, primarily as an artist. I'm not an academic or a scientist, so I have a little bit of liberty to kind of say what I want, and I don't have to prove anything. So, and so I've always been an artist and approach these things from that point. As far as Christianity is concerned, I grew up and was raised in a typical American pop culture, secular exposure to Christianity, So I get to see it through, rock and roll, sci-fi, fantasy, things like that. I was the dungeon master, so, heavy metal, hard rock, of course, had strong Christian themes. So that was really my exposure. So a lot of apocalyptic kind of, Gen X apocalypse experience of Christianity. And so I really never had any sort of formal church or religion from that standpoint. But one of the earliest experiences that got me on the dying track was a powerful poltergeist experience. And so that kind of opened up the paranormalization process. It's
sure.
Paranormal activity doesn't freak me out as much as other people. And I'm not really, I don't have a death grip on proving anything. Sometimes you have an experience. It's like, I don't know what to say, but I know that your, kind of reductionist view is wrong in some significant way, because I can't help it, So there's that kind of experience with the paranormal and the afterlife that I think really set me, kind of committed me to a path of what is going on here in terms of, death, dying, and afterlife and all of it, right? So, and of course, I've reinterpreted that experience over and over again throughout my life. And then at some point in my searching and growing up in my early 20s, I did have a few years in a fundamentalist cult, Christian cult type experience. We're pretty dedicated to whatever they're dedicated to, and it was the theology was very strongly death denial, probably one of the strongest death denial type forms that I've seen in fundamentalism, modern, fundamentalism type stuff. But I certainly learned a lot that I needed to at that point in my life. There was a lot of, that wild rock and roll background was missing quite a few things. And so that's probably what led me there. Plus the research books, that was when I first I was really drawn to the research books. And then thinking of the integral grammatology and the metaphysics of adjacency, immediately reminded me of years and years ago, like 30 years ago or whatever, geeking out on the prepositions in the Greek, and the different little symbols that represent, the in and the through and the with and whatnot. And so yeah, it's another thing that tickled me about, listening to this and learning about this from you guys. So, but then I left that experience and, lost my religion, disillusioned, whatnot. It was probably pretty good timing. I was about done and got married. And so the rest of this story is pretty much Kelly's there with me the whole time on the rest of this. So I won't say we all the time, but I almost could. So then, then I think I first got exposed to integral theory around that time as well, through rock and roll and things like that, and then led me to Integral Naked. And I was reading, Wilbur books and other things while I was selling art in the galleries. So it's quite a thing to be in a retail art experience while you're, learning and practicing all these new insights about transpersonal things and consciousness and whatnot. So, but shortly after that, after a period of retreat in Sisters, Oregon, where I had created this work, inspired by reading Ken Wilber's work and other things, and so that was a significant experience there in terms of being introduced, into integral theory even deeper through the arts. Then shortly after that, we encountered the Sacred Art of Living Center in Bend, Oregon, which is a world-class education center founded by Mary and Richard Groves that teaches these things. And we got deeply involved there as students, staff, friends, you name it. It was a real deep dive, and we were typically the youngest people around, because people tend to have gray and white or no hair, that are drawn to that kind of thing. And that was an amazing experience. Very integrally informed programs. And then we helped design and launch a 2-year apprenticeship program in the work, the Anamcara Project. And even at that time, I remember feeling like, okay, the integral scene has a big gap. Something's missing. And this scene is kind of a big piece of what's missing, as well as this scene is missing insights from the integral world. So I was very interested in how to overlap these two big ecologies of theory and practice. And
what was it you thought that scene had that you thought integral was missing?
Well, I think I want to get into that after I riff through this story real quick. That's a good question. That's a good question. I can say a lot about that. But nonetheless, I reached out to Integral, because at that time I was, in Ken's book and on Integral Naked as an artist, and in part of the tribe, the Integral Naked Fringe tribe, and they had sent out somebody from Integral Institute. We invited them to come out at no cost to come participate in the week-long part of the 2-year apprenticeship, the week-long gathering education part, and yeah, and there's a lot that can be said about all that. And so, but that was kind of what led me there. And then I, overlaid Aquil with some of the maps of the spiritual pain diagnostics and whatnot, and overlaps. A lot of the maps overlapped really well, and that really excited me too. And I've done a lot of art and graphics around that over the years. And then since then, I've hosted Death Cafes, which is a kind of an open source franchise, just all about talking about death, without any sort of agenda, death and cake conversation. I don't know if you're familiar, but so I've been hosting those for a year, just because it's an important conversation. But both of these fields, I've always been an artist on the fringe, an outsider. I've been adjacent. I've never really been in the center of these worlds. I've always been on the fringe, and I'm happy to be there. And then in recent years, I really saw much bigger connections with all this too, with a trip to Iceland to participate in Sean Esborn Hargen's Meta Capital Framework week-long retreat. And we looked at the healthcare system of Iceland there, and I really saw so much of this apply there as well. So yeah, that's kind of, the highlights of where the integral and the Christianity and the art of dying have kind of crossed paths for me, and kind of where I'm coming from. So, and then what I did was, getting ready for this little conversation, I put together kind of a list of all the points I would like to cover, and holy cow, yeah, good luck. So I don't know, we could start with your question. I've kind of got this loose list. I never really got around to organizing it in any particular order, but there's certainly a lot of things that I'd like to mention and talk to you about. And this recording, of course, can be.
Well, let's come back to that question, because there's something on my mind, which is, I talked to Reverend Paul Smith about integral Christianity last month, and he's an avid art collector, and that's one of the things we connected on, because I wasn't brought up Christian, so my awareness of the background Christianity of the culture was really galvanized through certain novels, Anne Rice novels and Salvador Dali paintings and things like that. And I wonder how you see the connection between like higher appreciations of Christianity and artwork, because they seem to have a lot in common. The people who seem attracted to one seem attracted to the other. What's the connection between, Christianity and art?
Yeah, I hadn't really given that much thought, and in terms of getting ready for this, there's certainly a lot to be said about it. Yeah,
But if you see any similarity between your appreciation of the one and your appreciation of the other.
nothing, nothing specific. I mean, I love art. I just, art has a role in every religion, every tradition. I mean, I think of, when people say religion, for example, and culture and, kind of healthy blue, to use spiral dynamics and whatnot, I go straight to holidays, decorations, rituals, celebration. It's about the food, so much about the food, at Blue. It's like, it's so underappreciated part of, recipes and songs and, and I mean, we're decorating, our rites of passage and rituals throughout life. We're decorating moments in time, and so the arts, are all over all of it, and I don't know. That's my
No,
quick
I
answer.
think that's a really good point because I think, in cultures where people are at orange or higher, there's a tendency to really analyze the rational content of things. But
Yeah,
at cultures before those levels, they're not as interested in the rational consistency of the content. It's not so much about whether the belief makes sense. It's
yeah,
about whether it brings people together and looks nice.
yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's a really important thing to appreciate about that level of tradition.
yeah, yeah. I agree. Um, what was the other question that you would ask? Something
It was
about,
you
oh,
were
what?
talking about this community and what you thought it was lacking that Integral
Yeah,
had, what you thought Integral was lacking that it had. And so I was curious,
correct.
what you thought that lack was.
Yeah, yeah. Well, on the sacred art of dying side, of course, it was just that isn't the specialty there. So a lot of the people involved are not familiar, but some of them are, especially the ones that are designing and weaving and kind of composing the weave for the programs and whatnot. Were very, very integrally informed and referenced various aspects of integral thought and practice in the work. But on the integral side, and these are some of the important points. I think these are probably, for the context of this conversation, probably more important, just because the integral stage, right? So one thing that I thought of, that I continue to see, is the lack of respect for the aging and the role of aging in our conversations about stages and states of consciousness and types and stuff. Now, let me back up a minute though, because so here's the thing with the sacred art of dying, that how I like to describe it, is that it's not just about dying in hospice. It's about aging. It's about suffering. It's about illness. It's about grief. It's also about caregiver burnout and compassion fatigue and caregiving community. So much of all religious history is kind of rooted in that when you have a lot of younger people interested in a philosophy like, oh, integral Christianity or something, right? That is like, if we're going to stand on the shoulders of giants, we cannot leave those giants out, because that is kind of the template that formed so much of our religious awakenings and histories, and so I saw a lot of lack of understanding about aging and its role in it all, right? And sometimes when you're older and somebody's younger and somebody's saying something, it's like, they've not been there, and you may not even be able to convince them of that. And so there is a part of age that plays a role. Also, the this idea that in development, we can kind of assume that the highest stages of development are going to be in the oldest people. Not that old people are, age is guaranteed, right? But if we are going to find wisdom and find out where those insights are from, those direct experiences of those advanced structures, it's going to be in the oldest among us. So I've come to a conclusion long ago that if we start from the end of development and then look backwards through that funnel, we're going to see more, quite a bit more. And so the context of caregiving puts you in that arena immediately, directly. And and not only in caregiving for another, but in our own die before you die practices, because the end of life spirituality is kind of that at the root of all, good religion, I guess, is, this die before you die. Right. And so, to even look backwards, start at the end and look backwards through our own life is kind of the regular check-in that keeps us anchored at both ends of life. Right. But caregiving in this world, doing your own work along those lines in order to be a caregiver and a companion for others, is probably, to me, it seems like the most vibrant and fertile field of practice and application for all the things we like to talk about in integral world, states and stages. And, it kind of remains theory so often until you are in that world. And also the paranormal. I would say, people who avoid death and dying and aging and old people and suffering and illness, and then have this really strong opinion about whether the paranormal is real or valid or not, you just haven't walked towards the thing that is going to show you. And once you do and spend enough time there, you're not going to know what's going on, but that's besides the point. At a certain point,
There's certainly a much higher rate of integration of anomalous and paranormal phenomenon in cultures where they're much closer to the experience of death.
Yeah. And in my personal experience, I've seen that, and that is confirmed by a lot of people that are in this work and in these places, But so there's this thing about dying that, in a sense, anchors the whole spiral in some way, some sense. I'm not making some big philosophical claim, that I'm going to publish in a book. I'm just saying I think that is what is going to help elongate and connect you to the whole thing, midwifery at both ends and then all points in between, but both ends especially,
That's really interesting. I can see where, the experience of death with yourself and with someone else is a place where a number of the elements of an integral type model are made really explicit. In particular, the encounter with other states part, but also the maturational phases part. And I think you said it pretty well, which is, being older doesn't guarantee that you're an elder, but if you're going to be an elder, it's going to take time, right? Developmental transitions take some time. So the odds are the most likely place to see them is in the oldest people if they've been healthy and growing and evolving and thinking and feeling all the way along.
Yeah. There's notions in the sacred art of dying that I've found very valuable over the years. Just real simple concepts that can be unpacked, but even the one-liner of it is enough to really kind of help a lot. Like that the dying are our greatest spiritual teachers. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean that they're teaching you a spiritual lesson, intentionally, but that being around that world, when somebody in their dying it brings us all into a liminal space. Simply the act of them doing that and being in that place, and so the most profound lessons we'll ever learn are in that interface and around that. And the most transformational moments also, the most hottest ones that have lasting impact happen there as well. There's also the notion of that healing is possible in spite of there being no cure. That helps kind of put a check on the fixer run amok of orange and green and other worldviews, where what does that look like? What kind of healing is possible even when there's no cure, and so that's a saying in this world. And then there's all this wisdom unpacked around it, I feel is like much needed, especially now with all our multiple crises and reasons to grieve and our losses that are occurring, in the world, in our lives and throughout the world, right? there's another idea that matches kind of what you were saying, where in the Enneagram plays a very strong role, especially through the center where I was learning. It's a very strong role in wounded healer work, but also in understanding, being in companionship with others in their suffering and dying and grieving, right? And there's a notion there that, and I'm sure in the fields of the Enneagram they touch it, but in its application in the art of dying, there's a notion that our Enneatype, and that what all that means, becomes more vibrant all the way up into the end, and it actually is more vibrant, useful, detailed, and necessary to understand all the way up until the end, and especially at the end. And it's one of the most powerful kind of maps and tools for caregiving and end of life work. Particularly, its relationship to shadow and suffering and things like that. So that's one way. That's
true for like even someone who's going into death with a great deal of dementia, like the breakdown of the gross psyche, and when you're with them, all you can sort of experience is their general presence because you can't access them as a regular neurological entity.
Yeah, you the dreams, the whole category of dreaming becomes much more vibrant as well. The whole category of communication with ancestors, that becomes more upfront as well. One of my dear friends and teachers, they teach coma communication, where there are ways of communicating with people in comas, various states of delirium, Alzheimer's, dementia, and different tools and ways of communicating that are non-ordinary, but very, very powerful. And to connect that to Christianity, I think back on the stories and the legends, from the Gospels of all these associations with people, suffering and dying. Lazarus, for example. I think of how the Gospels seem like outsiders wrote the story. These are outsiders talking about the situation. 4 different outsider views in a way, and what the story may be pointing to, in my opinion, is not only all of the stories kind of pointing to a revolution in caregiving, contemplative caregiving that was happening, which was really more of a remembering of Hebraic indigenous practices, but you kind of see the revolution in caregiving happening in a fluency with those states and it looks like a miracle to the writer of the Gospels. Oh my God, he raised him from the dead. But that idea of being able to communicate with people in a comatose state, and that having a huge impact on them maybe coming out of that loop has profound, implications in a lot of things, So yeah, all kinds of states become, and then you get beyond state chasing that way as well, just for entertainment purposes or consumer, personal work, it becomes, all this work in states and stages is now in direct service in the fires of it all, not in some, I don't know, not to belittle other applications, but really these are the fires of where this stuff was kind of discovered and it has the most impactful applications.
The tension between embracing death and rejecting death spiritually is really interesting, because there's, on the one hand, Christ is the ultimate image of the wounded healer. Yeah. And, it's an interesting religion in which it puts death right in your face the whole time, Christianity. Yeah. On the other hand, like you were hinting at earlier, a lot of people might get into Christianity in a form of death denial, where they're going to be magically saved from death, which is what they're thinking of. And if I translate, I start thinking about the integral thing, and there's a sense in which the eros, the constant triumphal evolutionary development sounds very great, but nonetheless, you're absolutely going to perish and fail in that process at some point. Yeah. So, how could a developmental philosophy integrate and understand and appreciate death better than it does? What would we need to remember? How do we need to work at this?
That's a good question. The first thing I think of is kind of like I've been saying, where if the people who are into the transpersonal world of meta models and all these things were to lean into those worlds and seek out applications in those scenarios, which in the work, there's a kind of a common notion that comes up where, when you're looking for practical applications of this, you don't have to go far. You don't have to make something up or come up with something extra. All you really have to do is probably look next to you, and there it is. But for a lot of people, maybe it isn't. Maybe they're surrounded by all people their age or whatever, and they don't have relationships with people in these situations. Then I would say that to seek that out. But what would inspire people to do that? For me, I always go back to the arts. It is a remembering process, a lot of it, rather than discovering something new, because why reinvent the wheel when we've got an entire planetary history full of wisdom traditions that are bone deep in this reality, in these realities. And so oftentimes I think of the arts being a great avenue. My mentor, Richard Groves, when he would travel the world and go to other countries and other regions around the world and other continents, he wouldn't go there to bring his Judeo-Christian Celtic knot of practices and wisdom. He would go and draw out and invite what's already there, that maybe in there, in the Chinese modern medicine model, is missing. That's indigenous to that world, to that land. And so that's a part of it. I know when we were looking at the healthcare system in Iceland, I saw it pretty clearly in a lot of different ways. And I was imagining how, this generational fragmentation that has occurred, where people hang out with people their same age, right? And this lack of seeing virtue or heroism or coolness in the wisdom tradition of where you're from. I think I don't know if I'm getting off track or not, but the idea is to somehow, through the arts, language, mythology, reawakening this attention to it, for one, and this seeing the value of it in whatever language that takes. It reminds me of there was a man who was trying to fix the toilet problem in India. People are basically, crapping wherever. And part of what he discovered was, you kind of make these parades and celebrations, and you make it popular, and you give people awards for you have a thing on your thing that I bought a toilet. We don't shit on the street anymore, and somehow that was drew people's attention to, to things. So anyway, I guess it's a rabbit trail, but somehow the arts and language and helping us remember.
Yeah, the ritual and the social aesthetic plays a huge role in that.
And especially as it applies to things that are kicking our ass right now. I think that is one of the major potentials of the art of dying. It's if you show fluency around the topic when people are in the thick of it, they'll notice. For the most part, people will notice, oh wow, nobody knows how to handle this. Nobody who is fluent in this world. And then when somebody does step in and is fluent, there's this awakening, remembering, wow, this is something, and so those are always opportunities as well to point in the direction and say, okay, now you see how important this is, and then how that fits then varies, of course.
Do you think it's important to start that journey toward fluency earlier? Are we, meaning the West, are we not exposing children to death enough?
Oh, I think so. I think one thing I noticed in the Sacred Art of Dying work with, we'd have most people that are attracted to the work are aging, second half of life, doctors, nurses, chaplains, monks, nuns, therapists, counselors, but these are professionals that are reevaluating their own careers and dealing with their own compassion fatigue, caregiver burnout, trying to align their vocation with deeper discovery. And there seemed a common buzz with, that I noticed as a younger person, that a lot of people felt that, oh my God, where was this all my life? Because I think there are, and there have been throughout history, there seems to be traces of all generation applications of wisdom, the vidui, the annual kind of like, and I'm not an expert on the vidui, but the sense I get from it, it's like this annual letter, like final words that every year you pull out and rewrite throughout your life. And it's, things that you want. It's kind of like a spiritual will and bigger, right? And it's a very old tradition. But to teach children how to start their vidui and do it every year would be fabulous. It would probably, now it feels like it's kind of too late in so many ways, because we're so many generations deep in death denial. The last century has been such a death denial culture in such a strong way. And it's affected everything from how we build our houses to, everything. And so whatever we do with children, there's going to be a wait, right, before that kicks in, if you even get access to show children anything new. So I think there are all age applications to really all kinds of wisdom, just about everything. There's applications that match and are appropriate to that age, which is part of why I'm drawn to, games and toys a lot, I think. Because, it's one thing to go try to help somebody who's 60 or 70 transform their consciousnness, and that has a lot of impact. It could have a lot of impact on the people who are still alive, but to inspire kids, I think is an important part of it.
I'm curious about how you appreciate the balance between embracing death on the one hand and struggling not to die on the other. The classic do not go gentle into that good night, right? And there's a lot of situations in which we feel like we're dying and we feel like we might have to accept death, but really we don't. And if we put a little more effort into it, we might steer away from that. And people do seem to have a weird self-destruct thing in them sometimes. But on the other hand, it's inevitable and we need to be graceful about it and wise about it. So how do you balance those?
Yeah, right. The paradox, the ever-present paradoxes that are everywhere. For me, it has a lot to do with, I get a sense of it from things like karma yoga or the seventh generation ethic, where even in my art, I think these are future fossils, like Michael Garfield's concept of future fossils. It's really realizing that, that one, you are going to die, and that everything you do will then there will be something afterwards. And so if you kind of make your every moment, your every practice, your every decision connected to your care for people who are going to be around when you're gone, then your ability to know that you're going to die and have kind of a plan that's rehearsed and re-rehearsed, but then live as richly as possible in light of that. I mean, how a lot of people who have near-death experiences, they come back and their lives, they see a reason to kind of thrive and stay, and so there's some of that. That can also work against us, though, because sometimes it is time to go, and so working out what is keeping that from happening, and a lot of times it's the medical system that's keeping it from happening. But the will to live is pretty strong, for people. And so I don't know, I feel like I kind of danced around that a little bit, but
Well, you make me think of, a little over a year ago, my father went into a coma and was, near death, and came out of it and had to go through a whole year of learning to use his body again. And it was a very interesting period to be in for me, because first of all, I didn't know that he necessarily wanted to survive. So if I offered prayers, I had to offer them on a very open-ended basis. But also I lived through something like his death, and now he's still alive. But my relationship to him is altered somehow. It's very curious to me. It's like I've already done it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if he needs anything from me now.
Yeah.
Here's something that makes me curious, which is I've been reading this book for an interview I'm doing with the guy who founded the Simpole movement about planetary politics. And he uses the stages of grieving a lot as a metaphor for trying to let go of the national level of social organization and start to awaken to the real situation on the planet. And I'm curious what you think about grieving and letting go, and the death-like way that we have to release a level of identity that we're at in order to start to take action and make real a bigger identity.
Yeah. I think grief in general is a pretty good description of what transformation, vertical transformation, if you will, is kind of about, and so fluency with grief. And this is another reason why I feel the, leaning into that adjacency, right? Not just doing it, but leaning into the arts of dying in whatever form we can find, allows us to become intimately familiar with grief, in various forms. And then so we can apply it then outside of that context. And so it's like a training ground for all forms of transformation and leadership and things like that. And so, like, for me, I was involved in the education part of it, but I was not, I am not a professional doctor or caregiver, or, I really had no official role in this context. And so I was just, I'm an artist. I'm just a person. This is just my personal thing. And there was a struggle for a while with that, feeling like, what am I doing here? But almost immediately, and since then, I've seen nothing but nonstop applications in every other discipline. The wounded healer work and the caregiver burnout work and the different disciplines that prepare someone to be a healer who's not causing harm, are the same things that apply in all forms of leadership, management, parenting, education, because in a sense you're a caregiver in those worlds, and there's a sense of responsibility. So the bone deep transformational power of the art of dying and all the disciplines around that, they have direct application in all these things, politics and everything, that I think are underappreciated. And it's a dynamic that, is yet to be, I feel, really tapped into in a way that we can, and somewhat more urgently,
There's a lot to criticize about Christianity over the years, but it's really unique in the way that it foregrounds death and grief and lamentation, as the heart of the mandala of the religion. It's a curious feature.
Yeah, I agree. I think the it's the first noble truth in a sense is there as well. When you read in the Old Testament that the smoke of the altar is a sweet smelling savor to God, and that these are the prayers of the saints. Well, what is that? That's pain. Where there's smoke, there's fire, right? That's some sort of pain. And so it really is about, suffering and pain. I mean, you read through the Gospels and the epistles, and it's so full of, the death and suffering is so necessary and such a part of it, but I'm not sure it's unique to Christianity. I think just different ways the traditions, kind of came up in their different corners of the world with their different mediums and experiences, came at it their way, right? But certainly Christianity is not, in a sense, it's not original. It wasn't original. It was more of a remembering and a re-illumination of a bunch of wisdom up to that point, in a sense. And so I think there's a lot of influences to be traced down in that art of dying, suffering part that predates Christianity. I mean, even the indigenous Hebraic history is,
Sure.
Wow.
Every being that's ever lived has died. So it's
Yeah.
all of that wisdom history as well. But
Yeah.
Christianity really, after its first couple hundred years, it really put the symbol of the vulnerable dead person right in the middle of what it was talking about. And I think it's somewhat unique in that respect of how much it emphasizes the death of its God.
Something I learned recently, I thought was learned a lot more about recently, in light of the pandemic, was how in the first centuries that was what caused Christianity to grow, was that when people were dying from plagues, they were the ones that ran towards the problem, when the Romans and everyone else was just, pay money to the gods, will protect you, and then they failed.
Mm-hmm.
Christians just threw their lives at service, and that's where, original hospitals and caregiving, that's why a big reason why I connect that to the original Christian experience had a lot to do with, the monks and nuns who were the doctors and nurses, and that pattern repeats itself throughout Christian history, as well as interreligious collaboration. I think there's a lot about Christian history and interreligious collaboration around the context of hospitals and hospice that probably would go a long way to help recover and redeem Christianity in modern times. I think a lot of times we think of, the hospice or caregiving or the hospital history of Christianity as some kind of like a subcategory, like an elective.
Yeah.
Or something, as opposed to really this is what was happening.
That makes
This
a big
was
difference.
the reason.
If you think of, say, indoctrination and crusades as the main thing, and hospice as a side, or you think of the hospitals as the main thing and the crusades as the aside.
Right. Where it's a little different than that. It isn't just like this or that. It's, deeper gems and veins of practice and wisdom happening while this other stuff was happening too, and there's so many rich rexamples throughout history of, for 500 years, for example, throughout like Spain and whatnot, and parts of Europe, there was a collaboration between, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and it was all around the context of the art of dying.
Yeah.
And they developed this hospice system kind of throughout Europe over the centuries, and they were not arguing. In fact, they one of the things they did was they recognized their shared. They would stop fighting or stop arguing theologically because they agreed that the book of Job is something we all love and makes sense, and as it applies to the art of dying, for example. And the Psalms was another remarkable part of things. I was listening to something you guys were talking about the other day about music and the applications of music and mood, and it reminded me of how the Psalms were one thing that those three religions, practitioners of those three religions, agreed upon as applied mood music for suffering and dying. The Psalms are not a book of doctrines. It's, in fact, Richard often teaches and talks about how the the old manuscripts, the Psalms, the illuminated Psalms, over the years, the nuns and monks wrote in the margins how people were responding to the moods in their suffering and dying. And the whole field of music thanatology is really, really a fabulous place for the arts, applied arts in this, there's just so much history.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how, like, as a person who was not raised Christian, one of my main areas of contact with it is graveyards.
Mm.
Once in a while a funeral, but when you walk out among these Celtic crosses and these, in the country I live in, it's almost exclusively Christian graveyards. So when I encounter the dead, I encounter ancestral Christianity. So for me, it's one of my main sources of how I feel about it.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, me too, because there's so few modern expressions that are like accessible that even touch those roots. And so I grew up, like I explained, outside of that context, and you have to find it somewhere else. It reminds me of the in the Gospels, the idea that they were telling Jesus, that who are you? We're of this group, we're of this religion, we're sons of Abraham, or whatever they're saying, and he's like, well, God could bring this stuff right out of the ground if he wanted to, so I don't know what you're talking about. If it's not happening, it's going to come up somewhere else. And in fact, Balfour Mount, who is the person who put palliative care in the dictionary, he did a great talk on how those impulses kind of seep up through pop culture. He referenced the Beatles and Iron Maiden and all these other references, and so you start looking and you see it where the churches have failed. Pop culture it'll show up, just like a weed will pop up through the cracks in the asphalt. The art of dying is going to find a way to remind us, because it's bone deep wisdom. A lot of it is about remembering, and there's a lot of stuff to learn that can be lost and forgotten. So there, lineages and all these things are important, but there's a part of it that is accessible through soul, and other things, and sometimes that's what we're left with.
I heard a story, I don't know if it's true or not, but the idea that the first Catholic missionaries who were sent to Tibet hundreds of years ago were sort of shunned when they got there. And what they didn't realize was when they were trying to explain about resurrection, the Tibetans had a word for it, but it meant zombie, essentially. And they thought these people had a zombie cult of some kind.
Yeah.
Took them a while to figure out the translation. But I'm curious what you make of the mass popularity of The Walking Dead, in all of its different guises.
Yeah. That's certainly interesting to think about. And part of that is, I see, just in this fear of disease and brainless people, mass, and this is a deep, almost animal level instinctual fear. Like a lot of our fiction and literature is kind of really, there is that part of it. It's not all intellectual. A lot of it's being driven by unknown things, and I think this underlying realization of, wow, we are in a situation where we can have a massive amounts of people that are threats to other people, this kind of anti-human, anti-social violence stuff, and so and certainly part of it's death denial. I think the romanticism of the horror genre can be connected to it as well, because just because somebody like really is into the Grim Reaper doesn't mean they're fluent in the art of dying whatsoever. Sometimes it's a mask, to protect us from leaning into that world. If I just, wear my Grim Reaper t-shirts, I don't really have to go visit old people, or something, along those
Yeah.
lines. So, mhm.
I mean, the thing that's most alive for me is this question about what do I do? What do I do in my heart in order to make myself more available to the reality of death?
Mm. Yeah. I think, yeah, there's a lot to that. And there's practices we've been doing this since we became people, and before as well, because we know animals also, some of the higher animals have their rituals and habits around it, and so I think, the idea of, like, the Enneagram, for example, being something where what spiritual practices and other activities apply to us most directly varies pretty wildly from type to type. And so questions like that are kind of hard to answer, because I would, then it becomes, I have to know more about you and start,
Yeah.
point out things. But there's certainly a lot we can do.
The Enneagram is interesting. I'm not super versed in it, but I'm pretty familiar with Gurdjieff, who it's associated with. And one of his interesting ideas was that we don't just have souls or not have souls. We have sort of the parts of a soul, but you have to do something while you're alive in order to bring that together so that you have a vehicle for when you die. What's your take on that? Like, what is it that we might need to do while we're alive in order to die well and maybe live in some other fashion?
Yeah, I mean, it's living well is part of it, right? The art of living well is the art of dying well. And so it really is one of those questions, if I want to die well, um, yeah, no, that's a good question. Again, it gets into specifics, and I always shy away from that, because I'll say this though, I'll say that one of as it relates to the soul question, um, I have this view of the evolution of medicine or caregiving that relates to all this, that kind of goes like this, and where, it's an evolution of where the patient is, where the wound is what moves in this metric that I'm using here, and then, of course, then what the treatment looks like. And so, we start with our oldest forms of medicine and our folk medicine and all these practices, all the way up into Western medicine, where then the patient becomes not even a person, it becomes the wound itself. The patient is the broken bone, not the person with the broken bone. It is the broken bone. We treat the broken bone. That's the patient, and then once we get past that, it starts expanding again into, more alternative and integrated medicines, where, and then in the kind of the green world where anything goes, and then people start saying holistic, when I don't think they really, a lot of them don't mean holistic, or they're not really clear on what that means, but it's kind of becomes this piling on type thing. There's the second tier move in medicine is the radical shift of who the patient is, becomes the caregiver, becomes the patient, and that becomes, the interior move: caregiver, wounded healer work, compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue and caregiver burnout are a big part of healing from green, right? Because when, whether you're an activist or you're a nurse or a volunteer, whatever that green kind of heart-based, thing is, eventually you're going to find out that, oh my God, I'm exhausted. This is not working out necessarily. So it moves into that, and then moves into the deeper interior work of the wounded healer work and whatnot. Particularly as a caregiver, I would say that not making that move, where the self-examination is going on a deeper level, where you're identifying the woundedness in yourself as a healer, you probably shouldn't stay in the business too long. It should, I would say we do well if that was kind of a minimum point of entry. Like, this is our target for healers. Let's get them to second tier. Because if not, they cause harm, more harm than good often, which if you look at our medical system, it's kind of hard not to deny that, the widespread harm, right? And so anyway, then that expands from there into the next level of patient is community of caregivers. Not just one caregiver doing his inner work, but a community caregiver. And then the next expansion of that becomes, healing hospitals and healthcare systems. Those are the patients. The hospital is the patient, right? And then, like we learned in Iceland, we're looking at the healthcare system, but we find that a lot of the healing potential in work is not inside the context of a healthcare system at all. The healthcare and the healing and of the medical component of society, a lot of that is outside of the healthcare system. It's not their job. They're like, I'm not going to go tell you guys to make your doors bigger so we can get grandma out of the hospital. That's the only reason keeping grandma out of the hospital is the fact that we can't bring her home because the doors are all too small in all the houses that you've been making for generations or something like that, right? So there's this component where then it expands to not only healing the healthcare system, but healing society's view towards healing and healthcare becomes the patient. And then on to planetary, medicine and whatnot. And then in that journey, there's that part where the community of caregivers are accessing soul deeply. And we learned a lot of this through, it was kind of a hybrid of ancient Celtic practices, some other Judeo-Christian practices, but especially the Quaker practices from Parker Palmer's work was a fundamental part of our practicum work, where our group work had a lot to do with inquiry and assumptions about how the soul works, what soul is. I tend to lean towards the language of I have a soul, right? Kind of more the Jungian, there's this collective field that, we're all just kind of fruit on the tree, but to have dialogue arts, which is a lot about the hospitality and companionship of it all, that make assumptions about the soul that allows the soul to show up in ways that it will not if you don't do that, is vital to this level of healing and work and caregiving and understanding, kind of the condition of, what it is we're trying to care for, and so I don't know, that was kind of a long roundabout way of connecting back to the soul things. That's so important. There's a notion that the soul responded to, or the soul tended to responds 1,000-fold. And I don't think that's an exaggeration in my experience, and we can live our entire lives and not know what that means or ever go there.
It's showing up because it's invited by the dialogue in a certain way. It's assumed, and therefore it's showing up.
Yeah. Well, even like dream work, let's say someone who's not familiar with dream work, they start applying some form of dream work. And at first, that may be quite a radical shock. The dream, it's like soul was like, where have you been all my life? All right, I'm showing up now that you finally pay attention. It's like wiping that little layer of dust off the gemstone. It's like, holy wow, and it was not that far away the entire time. It was right there, and there's a lot, and through dialogue, and that's something that I'm working on that I'm really interested in talking to you and Bruce more about, with the grammatology and whatnot, because I've been experimenting with hosting sessions. Over the years since then with my own version of how to duplicate this powerful way of accessing soul through dialogue.
I think we should do another one of these with Bruce and focus very much on language and dialogue. I mean, it's such a profound and fertile topic. I feel like I could go on endlessly prompting you with questions. But let's assume we have only 5 or 10 minutes left. And is there anything else you thought of in advance that you wanted to touch on in this that we haven't gotten to yet?
One of the interesting things I learned was how the Celts, their non-dual caregiving philosophies and practices predated Jesus, and they were already in the world doing their thing. And but at some point in early Christian history, they brought the notion of Anamcara, or soul friend, to Christianity, which is kind of a layman's way of being. It wasn't a specialized thing. It was like, we know how to listen and ask, which is something that's often missing in integral circles, especially. We tend to like sentences with periods in the end of it a lot, and a lot of them for a long time. We like 900-page books and whatnot, right? But there's this kind of out of the mouth and throat into the ears, and asking well. And that was really common. And then it was taught to the Christians at some point, from how I understand it. And so holy listening and these other things become part of it. And when you're searching for a companion to be your companion in life and death, you're on Anamcara, you don't wait until the last, until you get the diagnosis and you're told you have a month. Back then it was like, oh, I have, some gray hairs, I better start looking. Because you're going to develop these friendships and these companionships for second half of life work all the way to the end, right? And so that's kind of what was introduced, but at some point it kind of got distorted, this ability to be companions, to know how to draw out soul and listen well and ask well. And then it got kind of reduced and muddied down into our confession booths. So with the kind of deterioration of Christian history and practices and its different ways, even the Celtic influence kind of watered down in that direction. But really the hospitality and the arts of friendship, I think, is a huge part of it, the basis of it. That's the word that kind of covers the whole gamut for me in terms of the essence of it, is hospitality. And that's where the arts are, that we're so antisocial, and we complain all the time about how rude people are, but any sort of reawakening towards hospitality, friendship, sociocracy, for example, right, being a organization by way of friendship, it's like, what is that? That, I think, is what really is going to lead us into what we need to navigate what we're experiencing now, and to get to the other side of it somehow.
Yeah, I think people are starving for that, even people in higher discourse communities.
yeah I notice it whenever I have introduced or facilitated it in any form, whether just on the fly in some outside of context, or in some sort of experimental session that I'd host. I noticed that people respond quite powerfully to that, and it's like, what is this? I didn't even know this is something we can do. It's really that foreign to us somehow, even though it's as old as the hills, as they say, a lot of it. So integrating it with all our new stuff is, God, we have to.
Well, this has been very nice getting to know you, and these are amazing topics. And let's consider this the prologue to an ongoing conversation.
Sure, appreciate that. Yeah.